And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And Tom's Place, for the finest in men's fashion. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted.
Thank you so much, Becky. Welcome to another episode of the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. It is much appreciated. Apple Records. Everybody's familiar with Apple Records. That, of course, was the label that the Beatles founded. But why did they do that? Just because they wanted a place to record? Well, apparently there's more to it, at least, than that. And what happened after Apple Records? Dark Horse Records. Dark Horse Records, founded by the late George Harrison. And our guest today, Aaron Badgley, who is a noted writer and a broadcaster, has written a fabulous book called Dark Horse Records, the story of George Harrison, Post-Beatles record label.
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, really want to be with you, really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord, my sweet Lord. My Lord, my Lord.
Aaron Badgley, it's nice to meet you, sir. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on. As I said, I'm a big fan, and I've been listening to you for a long time, Mr. Wallachin.
Yes, I am. Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. Those are kind words, and I mean that. I've read so much about the Beatles, and we've had people talking about the Beatles on this podcast and back when I was on the air. And just when you think you know everything about the Beatles, wham, comes out another book about the Beatles, one of the Beatles anyway, and you think, wow, there's even more. And it's just, it's fascinating. I mean, there have to be courses in universities being taught strictly on the Beatles. There must be somewhere.
I think out in Memorial there was a university, because I think they do a master's program. So I haven't gone yet, but I might.
Yeah. Let's talk about yourself. Introduce yourself to the good folks that are listening so they don't feel that you're a stranger to them. You started working back in radio back as a young lad at the age of, 18, 19?
That's right. Yeah, when I was about 17, 18, I started working at a station in Oshawa. And I did a lot of freelance work for stations in Toronto, and I worked in Ajax. And just then I moved to Ottawa. I worked in radio in Ottawa and Cornwall, which was an experience. And I've been writing for magazines and publications since I was about 22, 23. So yeah, I always loved music, and I always like to write about it. So
now you're still doing some radio stuff now, right? You're co-hosting a show called From Memphis to Merseyside.
Yeah, Memphis to Merseyside. It's a show that my friend Tony Stewart and we do, and it focuses on music from 1954 to 1980. And we look at social events that happen and tie in music. So, we might look at the Kennedy assassination, or we might look at, things the concert for Bangladesh, and talk about, things that was going on. So, yeah, it's a social music program.
And you're a writer for Spin Magazine?
Yeah, I write for a lot of Spill. I write for Immersive Audio. It's a good thing I retired from my day job.
I was going to say, yeah, for a guy who's not working, you're working a lot. Tell us about Spill Magazine. Where is it published? Is that a Canadian or an American publication?
It's Canadian.
Or British?
And
Canadian?
I'm kind of because I'm probably one of the oldest writers on their staff, I tend to cover things like I'm interviewing Steve Hackett from Genesis, and I write a lot about, I got to interview Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. So I kind of write about music that's been around for a while. Sometimes I do new bands, but it's my interest in knowledge tends to be the older stuff. And Spill's a good magazine because they combine the two. So you can read it, and you're going to read about the latest band out of LA, or you read about, what exactly is Paul McCartney up to. So it's a good balance.
I find it interesting with reading about the artists from back in the 60s and 70s, because that was the age when I got into radio in the 70s, late 70s, actually. But I got into it in terms of as a listener, and to read about these artists, such as Ian Anderson, for example, today, and think, wow, I mean, this is really quite fascinating, because, your perspective back then and your perspective now is totally different, as is theirs.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk to them about, because I interviewed Phil Manzanero, which was like the most incredibly difficult thing, because I'm a huge Roxy fan. And he talked about that, actually. He talked about being young and being in Roxy Music in the 70s, and now being, having gone through Floyd, and he's an elderly gentleman, and he just views things very differently. And it's interesting to get their take on the music that they did back in the 70s and 80s, and I guess even the 90s now.
Well, it'd be interesting if you could listen to an interview that they did back in say, 73, 74, and then interview them today, and just listen to how their thoughts have changed and how their attitudes have changed. And they give you an example. I happened to be just flying through the internet one night, and I ran into an interview that was done, and I don't know how many years ago, but it was Dan. Now, here's a weird combination. Dan Rather is interviewing Alice Cooper.
Really?
Yeah. You Google it, you'll probably find it. He talks about his drinking and how he got through his whole alcoholism, and well, he still is. I guess what you are, right? But he talks about how he never thought he was. He just thought that having a beer for breakfast was normal at a young age, And he says, of course, when you're 26, you're bulletproof, right? And everything's no big deal, until it finally started getting at him, and like physically, he could see the signs. But it was interesting listening to him talk about those days. And I'm thinking, geez, if he had talked to him back then, what would his attitude have been like as an interviewee, and what would his answers have been like versus what are they now?
Yeah, you can see that. Like, I did the same thing with, I was watching Paul McCartney interview from 73, 74, and he's a bit swaggerish, and he's talking about wings, and he's a bit. And then I just watched an interview he did last year, and it's with Rick Rubin. Very different. But almost he has nothing to prove anymore, right? I don't know if these guys have anything to prove, or No.
Well, I guess you're 80. You pretty much what? Yeah. There's nobody you have to impress anymore. And you're right. There's nothing to prove. But hey, I'm here, man. I arrived. I did it. How did the idea behind writing about Dark Horse Records come about?
Well, you said something earlier on about, you read Beatle books, and all of a sudden you find something that's different. But the one thing I've read, a lot of Beatle books, hundreds. And when they talk about George Harrison's career, they tend to go, all things must pass, living in the material world. And then it's like he disappears until Cloud 9 in the 80s. And it was far from the truth. He did a lot in the 70s and 80s. And one of the things he did was he did this label. And I was always fascinated by this whole Dark Horse label, given that he initially wasn't even on his own record label. He was promoting other bands. And it was a really diverse label. I mean, the first couple of albums, you get British folk, and you get Indian classical music, and then you get kind of poppy jazz. Like, I mean, it's just an incredible label. And no one's written a book about it. So I always wanted to read about it. I wanted to learn about it. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book. So
sure, why not?
Why not?
So let's go back to the birth of Dark Horse Records and its predecessor and inspiration, which would have been Apple Records, which the Beatles formed. And I didn't realize this until I read your book, that Apple Records was really the brainchild of Brian Epstein, their manager, who suggested that they diversify in terms of building these little companies as tax shelters, one of them being Apple Records.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the idea to have their own record company. It was the idea to have all these different places to hide money, right? Legally.
Well, and one of the first things Apple did was they had a clothing store, and it was right downtown London. And they had all this, the building was painted very psychedelic, which all the neighbors complained about. They had to repaint it so it was just white. And the Beatles learned very quickly that they're not retailers. And the store ended up losing more money than it made. So when they shut it down, Lennon said, instead of having a going out of business sale, just give everything away, which caused about 20,000 people to line up in London to get free Beatle clothing. But you're absolutely right. It was Brian Epstein's idea. And you know what's funny? If you look at the Sgt. Pepper album, at the very bottom, it says, thanks to the Apple. So there, even in '67, when they did Sgt. Pepper, there was still, the Apple was starting to come together. And then when it became a record label, because of Alan Klein and a number of other reasons, it just got, and the breakup of the Beatles, it just got really, really messy, right? With Sue Me, Sue You blues, as George Harrison would say.
Yeah. And Harrison's role in Apple Records was one of recruiting talent, primarily, was it not?
Well, you know, it was, once they announced Apple Records, they were inundated with tapes and films and everything else. And unfortunately, you know, Mr. Epstein didn't live long enough to see it come to fruition. But Harrison, of the four Beatles, really took to helping new artists. And if you look at the early Apple albums, there's artists like Doris Troy, who had a hit in '62 called Just One Look, Billy Preston, Jackie Lomax. He was helping a lot of James Taylor. He helped James Taylor on his first album on Apple Records. So Harrison has always been a very help-giving guy. And in fact, if you listen to the record by Badfinger, Day After Day, that's Harrison playing guitar and Leon Russell on piano. I mean, he got big names in to help out this band and became a top 10 hit worldwide. So it changed over time. And Harrison really liked the idea of helping new artists. It was really one of his favorite things.
And that was the idea behind Dark Horse Records, more than an outlet for his own music.
Yeah, and he thought the logic behind Dark Horse was if he has fewer artists, because Apple had a lot of artists, if he has fewer artists, it's not A, going to run out of money, and B, he can focus on each band. So there was Splinter, Ravi Shankar, a group called Jiva, Attitudes. He didn't go crazy signing, and he could have. Listen, he's George Harrison. I think, you know, I read in one person said anyone would have signed to his label if he had just merely mentioned it, right? But he wanted to keep it simple, and initially he was helping friends like Ravi, like Splinter. So it was. Now his hope was it would become a cottage industry because he had his own recording studio in outside of London. Make enough money per record to keep the record company going. That was the kind of the logic. He wasn't looking for a top 10. I mean, I think if records went top 10, he would have been very happy. But,
sure.
You know, that wasn't the goal. The goal was to kind of keep the company going and, you know, financially sustaining itself.
So really the idea behind Dark Horse Records was not only to introduce new artists who needed assistance, but also to reconnect with some of his older friends that he had played with and met in the industry. Plus, eventually down the road, maybe get to his own music.
Well, and this was what So Dark Horse Records was distributed by A&M Records. And A&M Records signed the label, and this was never announced. And I was reading some contracts, and I got to talk to people from A&M. And the reason they signed Dark Horse was because they thought when Harrison's contract with EMI Capital is over in '75, he's going to go to A&M Records. Well, he didn't. He went to Warner Brothers. They offered him a bit more money and a bit more, you know, promotion. So A&M were not happy, but you're 100% right that they were hoping that they would have a George Harrison, because if you think about it, in 1974, 75, the Beatles had it was only 5 years since the Beatles had split. Let It Be had been number one. The Red and the Blue album in 73 had both become number one hits. And Harrison was still huge. I mean, Living in the Material World made number one worldwide. So everyone wanted a Beatle. And everyone knew that the contract with EMI was coming up in 75. And you know, for whatever reason, Harrison wanted to go to Warner Brothers for many reasons, and he did. And A&M kind of went, well, we don't want Dark Horse anymore. So that's basically what happened.
So we're talking here about a guy who is an artist who decides to start his own record label, which was not really that unique of an idea, of a concept. Sinatra did it with Reprise. I mean, you mentioned A&M. The A in A&M is Albert for Herb Alpert.
That's right. Yeah. No, it was nothing. A lot of art. I was actually, when I started researching the book, I was surprised to see the amount of artists. Bing Crosby had his own record label, Crosby Enterprises. So, and then the Stones had.
And he produced the Hogan's Heroes television show too, by the way.
Did he really?
Yes, he did. It's on right now, and I watched it the other day, and I'm watching the end of the credits. It says Bing Crosby Productions. I went, what?
I had no idea. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow, that's
anything to make money, man.
One of the oddest situation comedies ever made.
Yes.
So you're right. I mean, the Rolling Stones had their label. Zeppelin had Swan Song, and so Harrison. Sometimes these labels are also, what they call vanity labels, which is just they're going to put out their own music and not help anyone. Harrison really, he did try to help other artists, and it just didn't click for various reasons. All the artists, although the first single he put out, Splinters, Cost to Fine Town, was a big hit in the UK and Europe.
Not so much here in Canada, though.
Peaked at 56 on the RPM charts, and I think it did really well in the East Coast. When I looked at the regional charts, the East Coast just latched onto that one, but Toronto, not so much.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor, or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca. I've had the great fortune to say that I've been associated with one of Toronto's finest names in men's clothing for more than 25 years. Tom's Place. Founded by Tom Mahalick's father in 1958, Tom's Place offers brand name men's apparel at unbeatable prices. But more than that, they boast a long-serving, knowledgeable, and friendly staff that can assist you whether you're looking for casual or formal attire. And they have plenty of first-class tailors on site. In addition, Tom and his family are well known for their philanthropic work. So if you're looking to deal with great people who can fulfill your clothing desires at outstanding prices, do yourself a favor and visit Tom's Place. They're open weekdays from 11 to 6, Saturdays 10 to 5, and Sundays noon to 5. You'll find Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Or check them out online at toms-place.com. Tom's Place will suit you.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
The Beatles' connection and George Harrison's connection with Ravi Shankar is a fascinating one. And Shankar was one of the artists that he signed to Dark Horse Records. And that did not turn out so well.
In terms of sales, well, even the interesting thing was he took Shankar on tour for his first solo tour. He was the first solo Beatle to tour in '74. Unfortunately, his voice was not the best, George Harrison's, I mean. And I don't know if rock audiences were willing to sit through a classical Indian orchestra in order to see George Harrison. And when you read the reviews, people were kind of surprised to walk in. And then on top of all of that, he was lecturing people. You won't find Krishna at the bottom of a whiskey glass and things like that. So that tour didn't help sell Shankar Family and Friends album. And then the second album on Dark Horse Music Festival from India was just it. I think I mentioned in the book the person from A&M who was helping Harrison promote the album. Harrison played the album for him and said, "I want this to be a big album." And the guy's like, "How, George? How? Like, how am I going to market this? But they tried, and it just didn't. It didn't catch on. But Shankar's never really sold truckloads of records, right?
No.
I mean, he'd sell
I
out
guess
Toronto, Roy Thompson Hall, but he wouldn't have an album in the top 10.
Well, that is quite fascinating. You mentioned Badfinger. Let's just go back to Badfinger for a second here, because that was probably the one band that the Beatles were involved with collectively, right? Didn't they also have all of them sort of had a little bit of a finger in that into that Badfinger pie, as it were?
Well, John gave them their name because they were originally called the Ivies, which is not a great name, and Lennon suggested Badfinger.
I remember finding out about you. Every day my mind is all around you.
Paul McCartney wrote Come and Get It, produced it, played his drums on it, and got it into a Ringo Starr film called The Magic Christian, which also starred Peter Sellers. And George co-produced their Straight Up album and played on it. And it was only when they left Apple that they... Now, I think a lot of people were surprised that Harrison didn't sign Badfinger to Dark Horse. I thought for sure, but he didn't. He let them, unfortunately, go to Warner Brothers, and that didn't end well for them. But all the Beatles really... I think they saw Badfinger as a kind of their protégés,
Well, that's what I'm going to say. But it's one of the more fascinating bands that they had occasion to work with and to support, that didn't sort of continue on in the way that they thought that they would have. I mean, as a protégé would. Yeah.
It's funny because, you mentioned you spoke to Kenneth Womack, who wrote a book about a guy named Mel Evans, who was the Beatles road manager, and he produced a big hit for Badfinger called No Matter What. And
great song.
Great song. And they had Baby Blue, which was just recently used in Breaking Bad. When Warner Brothers signed them, I think everyone thought that this was going to be the big break. But Warner Brothers, see, Apple was a small company, and you had people like the Beatles helping them out and directing them. Warner Brothers is a big company, and they became one of the bands signed to the label, and they were kind of allowed to just go their own way. Interesting story, though, is that the producer of Badfinger on Warner Brothers went on to produce the Sex Pistols.
Wow. Okay. That's almost as weird as Dan Rather with Alice Cooper. Yeah.
Yeah, Badfinger to Splinter, or Sex Pistols, yeah.
Eventually, George Harrison passed, and then just in the beginning of 2020, I guess, Harrison's son Danny took over Dark Horse Records and signed Cat Stevens.
Yep.
And Billy Idol. There's a bit of a weird combination as well there. Interesting combination, at least. How did that all work out?
Well, it's interesting. Just before we started talking, I got an email that they just signed the Nina Simone estate. So Dark Horse will be releasing Nina Simone records.
Wow.
Yeah. Who saw that coming? I think Danny and Olivia, George's widow, I think they wanted to kind of resurrect this label because they knew that it was George's passion. And George, for various reasons, one being his health, he couldn't work on the label and do the work he needed to do and wanted to do. So it's working out okay. They also signed, they're also putting out a lot of Leon Russell albums, and a guy named John Lord, who was a member of Deep Purple.
When you say they're putting out, are they re-releasing Leon Russell stuff?
Yeah, they're re-releasing the albums he did between 1975 and 1990, 89.
Is he still around, by the way?
Leon?
Yeah.
No, he passed away maybe 4 years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
So
that happens. You get these artists where you think dead or alive. Where there was a disc jockey in the States used to do a thing called Dead or Canadian.
Seriously?
Yeah. Very bizarre.
Anyway, that's brilliant.
I'm off track here.
I love it.
Yeah, it is.
I wish I had thought of that.
Yeah.
But, it's funny because, Joe Strummer from The Clash is on. And you think, remember Joe Strummer's famous London Calling phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust, and Harrison didn't like punk. He was very clear. He thought punk was just kind of non-music. And the other funny thing, you may find this funny, is one of the albums that Billy Idol's released on Dark Horse is a Christmas album, which, you know.
Now,
Again,
how did the Traveling Wilburys didn't fit into all of this in any way into Dark Horse?
No, what they did was they formed their own record label called Wilbury Records, and that was because Harrison wanted to be fair to the other guys in the band. I guess you got Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison for the first album, and of course Jeff Lynne, and so they formed Wilbury Recordings. However, Harrison maintained because Harrison had a company called Ganga, Ganga, and they maintained the copyright of that album to this day. And it kind of comes and goes. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but sometimes you can buy it, and then sometimes it's just off the shelves. So it's a very bizarre thing.
How does that work?
Well, I think, see, Olivia, Dark Horse was signed to Warner Brothers. When the contract expired, she signed to EMI. EMI went out of business. Then she signed to Universal, and now she's taken it to BMG, or Danny has. And part of the deal was that the Traveling Wilburys would come with the catalog, but they would have final say as to what BMG will put out. And right now, they haven't issued the Traveling Wilburys Volumes 1, and their second album is called Volume 3, of course. Makes sense. But
of course,
those are great albums too. And every time they get reissued, they go back to number one. Like I remember, I think 5 or 6 years ago, they put them back out in a box set, and it went right to number one worldwide. Mm-hmm. People love those albums. They're great albums.
That was quite a compilation of talent, the Traveling Wilburys, when you stop and think about it.
Well, and how they came together is a really funny story, which is Harrison needed a B-side for a third single from Cloud 9, and he's recording the song called Handle with Care. And he's recording with Jeff Lynne. Tom Petty stops by and says, "Hey, listen, Bob Dylan's staying with me. Why don't we get Bob involved?" They go to the house, and Roy Orbison is there because Jeff Lynne calls him because he's producing his album, and it just happened. And they were going to bury this song on a B-side, and someone very wise at Warner Brothers went, "Hang on."
Up and battered around, been sent up and I've been shot down. You're the best thing that I've ever found. Handle me with care.
This is too good to bury. And they were encouraged to do a whole album, and they recorded the album rather quickly. And I, to this day, I think the first Traveling Wilburys album, you get the best of everybody on that album, in my opinion, you know?
There have been, over the years in the history of contemporary music, at least pop music, let's say, songs that were recorded as the B-side that turned out to be better than the A-side, or as good as, in fact, the Beatles had a couple of those tunes where the A-side and the B-side were both on the charts at the same time, battling it out against each other.
Well, yeah, We Can Work It Out in Day Tripper is a good example. And the one that killed them is Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. And it didn't go to number one in the UK because they counted it as two separate singles. So Engelbert Humperdinck made out like a bandit by going to number one with Please Release Me. And Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane stalled at number two because they were, as you say, they were battling it out for sales, which is kind of funny in a way. And the other funny one was when they put out Magical Mystery Tour in England as an EP with I Am the Walrus on it. But I Am the Walrus was at number one with Hello Goodbye, which meant that the same song was at number 1 and 2. I'm a chart guy. I love charts. So
no. That's fascinating. That's fascinating stuff. For anybody who is a Beatles fan, or even if you're just a bit of a Beatles fan, or if you're a music fan at all, I highly recommend you pick up Dark Horse Records, the story of George Harrison, post-Beatles record label. It is as fascinating as the group itself. And Aaron, I thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. It's been great.
This has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for having me talk. I don't get to talk often, so this is nice.
Well, you should talk more often because you do a good job at it.
Thank you.
And you should put out a book about B-sides, by the way.
You know, you just twigged that in my brain when you said that a few minutes ago. I'm thinking that could be a good book because there's been a lot of great B-sides by The Who and The Kinks, and Even the Smiths, they did some great B-sides. So yeah,
I'm sure that the arguments have erupted over in between band members and management as to what's the A side and what's the B side here.
Well, that was the big argument with Something and Come Together, because Lennon, of course, wanted to Come Together as the A side, but the Beatles wanted Something. And here's a little bit of trivia: in Canada is the only country where they put Come Together on the A side for about a week. And then Apple said, no, Something. So if you can find a copy with Come Together as the A side here in this country, you got a bit of a gold mine there.
For people who don't realize the importance that George Harrison played in the role of the Beatles and what he was, give them an example of 3 or 4 songs that George Harrison wrote that people would immediately think it's another Lennon and McCartney bit. Lennon and McCartney did not write all the Beatles songs.
No, Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, Taxman, which is, although you know the story about Frank Sinatra. So he's doing George and Ringo are seeing Sinatra in Vegas, and Sinatra says, well, this is the greatest love song that Lennon and McCartney ever wrote, and he did Something. And George was like,
excuse me, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Chairman of the board. And that's why, by the way, Frank Sinatra, as you point out in your book, why Frank Sinatra is referred to as the chairman of the board, because he was the chairman of the board of Reprise Records.
Which is, again, he signed Hendrix. Who knew that was going to happen, right?
People are sitting at home, they're thinking, they're making this stuff up, man. They're making this up. This is half this can't be true. It is, though. Again, pick up the book, enjoy it before it becomes a motion picture, and stay tuned for the B-sides by Aaron Badgley coming to a bookstore near you. He just doesn't know it yet. Thanks again, my friend. All the best to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That'll do it for another episode of the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Don't forget to go online. Check us out, www.tedwallachin.ca. Leave any comments that you may have or any questions. And what we're going to do? We're going to do a survey soon. And what we'll do is we'll have some prizes for people who fill out the survey. That's what we're going to do. So we'll do that. tedwallachin.ca. And while you're online, don't forget to fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. And in the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Wallachin Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Wallachin Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwallachin.ca.